And welcome back, everyone. So, we're here now for section 2. I hope you all are doing okay. So, today, what we will be discussing is why Reconstruction failed, even with all of the efforts put forth by Lincoln and obviously the intentions of the radical Republicans. Why is it that it feels like we didn't really heal as a country? Why is it that we are still dealing with so much of the lasting effects from the Civil War and the race issues that were created as a part of it? So that's going to be the focus of today, and looking at it and how it comes out to today. So we're going to begin first with the election of 1868. Now, this is the second installment of their famous and a general, so now they're going to become president, and this is Ulysses S. Grant. So, with Grant, he's a tremendous leader on the battlefield. Unfortunately, that leadership ability does not translate to the Oval Office. He has zero political experience, and unfortunately, his 2 years in office, his 2 terms in office, 8 total years, are going to be plagued by horrific corruption. So much so that it kind of diminishes the ability of the Republican Party going forward. Now, his initial election was rather slim, winning the election of 1868. He wins by 300,000 votes. This is also the first election where we see African Americans able to vote, and 500,000 of his votes actually came from African Americans. Now, due to the Electoral College, that will be why he wins, not necessarily by just the virtue of the African American votes. But he is able to squeak out the win, albeit his time as president is not going to be the best, nor come anywhere close to his record as a U.S. military general. Now, in changing things, we first have one piece of legislation here, the Civil Rights Act of 1875. Now, this is important as that it guaranteed equal accommodations, meaning that you couldn't deny entry or use of a public facility to any person, regardless of race, gender, what it may be. Now, the problem with this is, one, did not apply to private locations, so many formerly public spaces and shops would turn private in order to keep out African Americans. Not to mention, all it said was equal accommodation, which would be taken many times by some governments as just being access. So this would then lead to situations of segregation, and of which we're familiar. So, for example, things like segregated bathrooms and entrances, this would become the norm, as, again, the Civil Rights Act of 1875 didn't really ban these, and it just kind of made it part of the point, unfortunately. Now, as for African Americans, we are going to be beginning to see some movement out of the South, some migration. Now, in the midst of the Civil War in 1862, the United States government is going to pass what was known as the Homestead Act. Now, much like how we look at Homestead, Florida, when we hear the word homestead, we think of farm on the range, farmland, and that's exactly what we're getting here. So what the Homestead Act of 1862 was, the reason why it was passed was in order to get people to move out to the West. And how do you get people to move to the middle of nowhere? Well, you give them a bunch of land for free. So if a person was on the land for 5 years and farmed on that land, they would get it for free. And so you had many ex-slaves who had nothing else. They didn't have money. They certainly didn't have the money to purchase land, but they would use the Homestead Act of 1862 in order to get land, move out west, and especially escape from all the horrors that were beginning to emerge in the South in the form of discrimination, not to mention the rise of terrorist groups like the Ku Klux Klan and the White League. But even outside of those issues, that does not mean that things were necessarily good for the former slaves. Now that we have slavery at an end, the issue here is, well, what happens to all of these freed people? What are they going to go do? Well, one of the options that gets kind of placed upon them is that they would be offered jobs. Now, at the very beginning, these people would be offered positions. They'd be offered a job, at which point they'd be taken care of, quote unquote. So they would be given clothes, meals, you know, they would just be taken care of at the work site, let's say. And when it comes time for payday, all that it basically then meant was that when they opened up that envelope and they would see their check, so to speak, it was in the negative. Their boss would charge them for all the things that they gave them, the work clothes, the food, the tools. And in essence, now that worker was indebted to their boss. They had to continue working just to pay off that debt, and they would just be stuck in this cycle. And this system is known as debt peonage. So basically they would find themselves in debt or just barely have the bare minimum, and they couldn't move to another job. They didn't have those kinds of prospects, unfortunately. So you had people stuck in these jobs, stuck with these bosses, just like slavery. Debt peonage was slavery by just another name. Now, to add to that misery, we then created this next system known as sharecropping. So, the former plantations, they would still be the same size. They didn't stop growing things. The only thing that changed was they no longer had a labor force that they could exploit for free labor. They no longer had slaves. So the plantation owners had to come up with a way of how to continue to cultivate the land, while at the same time they still wanted to maintain their system of exploitation, but now they couldn't do that via slavery. So the new system becomes sharecropping. So those large plantations would now be divided up into different lots, and they would have a family settle into those lots, and usually the families that settled into those lots were the former slaves of that plantation. But now they would be given the illusion of having, quote unquote, their own property. They would have the illusion of having their own space. Now, that space obviously didn't come free. It had a cost. So what they were supposed to do with that piece of territory on the plantation was that they would, as you see there, they would build a small house where they could live in. And then they would grow out on that land. And in exchange for being on that land and having, that building, it's terrible to even call it that, they would have to give half of the crops that they grew in exchange to the owner, and then they would keep the other half to, sell or use, during the year. Now, the thing is, though, it wasn't just former slaves who were abused by this system of sharecropping. It was also poor whites as well. And weirdly enough, this system would last all the way through to the Great Depression. So, seeing this system of oppression was something that was horrible, and it locked generations of families into. They were stuck in this system, and they continually found themselves abused. Now, in the South, they would begin to restrict the rights of African Americans and what they were allowed to do in society. Now, previously, prior to the Civil War, they would have a series of laws which banned slaves from committing certain actions, like walking around by themselves, entering parts of town. And you can just imagine the sorts of racist policies that go along with that. Now, these laws were known as the slave codes, but now that slavery is illegal, you had these southern governments who still wanted to keep these policies in place. So you would literally have laws where they would just scratch out the word slave and replace it with the word black or Negro. And these sets of laws became known as the Black Codes. Now the thing is, the 14th Amendment explicitly denies these sorts of laws. As we talked about the Equal Protection Clause earlier in the 14th Amendment, you can't give rights to one group of people and deny them to another. So because these laws specifically attacked black people in denying them rights, these laws were found to be unconstitutional. Now the thing is, You would then also see, as part of the black codes, laws essentially created just to arrest black people and strip them of their right to vote, as it was very common in the South and in other parts of the United States, to be honest, where if someone was arrested and convicted of a felony, they would then lose their right to vote. So, for example, you would have what were known as vagrancy laws. Now, vagrancy laws, all that they were was essentially standing around. If you were seen standing around in public, that was a criminal offense of which you could be arrested and have your right to vote stripped from you. So very often, they would arrest African Americans who just happened to be standing outside, charge them and convict them of vagrancy, and then strip them of their right to vote. Now, the South is going to take further steps in order to eliminate the right to vote that had been granted by the 15th Amendment. So that has to begin, though, with the Amnesty Act of 1872. Now, what this act did was that it essentially forgave all of the former Confederates, with the exception of the very top leaders. So now that these people were forgiven, they were allowed to vote again. They were allowed to run for office again. They were allowed to do all of these things. And now, once they can run for office, they can come back into power. They can vote back the people who they wanted to back in power. And once they are in power, they are going to make black people's lives miserable. Now, with the black codes being declared unconstitutional, they had to find another way around it. So, as I had alluded to in section 1, when I talked about how my son circumvented, going to bed, the South is going to do just that when it comes to voting laws. Now, Jim Crow laws, as they become known, are named after the minstrel character Jim Crow. Now, what a minstrel show was a show that was put on by white actors. They would dress in blackface, painting their face black, and they would act out horrific racist stereotypes, and basically all the stories would be about how black people were acting dumb, and the whole point of the show was about how, terribly dumb black people were acting, but obviously none of those things actually happened. It's just done to be racist and horrific. Now, the thing is, as we saw with the Freedmen's Bureau, which would help black men not only be able to vote, but also run for office and win election, that deeply upset a lot of the Confederates. So they are going to strike back and immediately try to get rid of the black vote. Now, the thing is, because of the 15th Amendment, you can't deny the right to vote due to race. So just like my son, they're going to try and find their way around the law. So, for starters, they would pass a poll tax. So you would have to essentially pay in order to vote. And because, again, many African Americans were stuck in sharecropping, stuck in debt peonage, they simply did not have the free money to actually go and pay to vote. So that eliminated a lot of the votes right there. On top of that, but what if they did have the money? What if they did decide to pay for it? Well, that's where the literacy test comes in, where they had to pass a reading test and writing test in order to vote. Now, the thing is, the test was written at the 8th grade level, which doesn't sound bad. You have to be 21 to vote during this time period, so passing a test when you're 14 years old does not sound that bad, except when you consider that most Americans during this time period went to school only up to the 3rd grade. Not to mention that, but the bar of difficulty in order to get a passing score on the test was difficult. For example, for out of 10 questions, you could miss no more than 2 questions. If you missed 3, well, you didn't pass the test. Now, the thing is, wouldn't these situations also affect white people? Because they're poor white people. They don't have money to pay the poll tax. White people didn't necessarily all go to school, so they're not able to pass that test. So, in order to prevent white people from being disenfranchised from the vote, they also came up with what they called the grandfather clause. So, they were exempt from the literacy tests and poll taxes if they could prove that if they were descended from someone who could vote prior to 1867, which of course meant only white people. So only white people could enjoy the benefits of the grandfather clause. They were exempt from the requirements of the poll tax and the literacy test. So that meant that the poll taxes and literacy tests just basically only did something to African Americans. But again, this is American history, so there will be worse. Now, because of the Reconstruction policies, because of the deep hatred of African Americans, that is going to lead to the rise of terrorist groups such as the Ku Klux Klan, not to mention the White League. They would terrorize black people exercising their rights. They would terrorize black businesses. They would just terrorize black people for the mere crime of existing. The most common, or rather the most notable way in which they would intimidate people was, as you see in the political cartoon here, that of the lynching. Now, what's particularly interesting in this political cartoon to take note of is that both of the individuals being lynched here are white. So, as we see here, we see the man holding the bag from Ohio, indicating that he is a carpetbagger. And of course, the man to his left would then be a scalawag. And as we see walking away is the donkey representing the Democratic Party, which, remember, at this time, prior to the Great Switch, was the Party of the South. And of course, the KKK letters written on that donkey. Now, the federal government would attempt to try and stop these things from happening. That they would try to stop the Ku Klux Klan, and to a degree they are successful. But the problem is that for many of the people who are involved in these crimes, quite simply, it's what I like to call the Hannah Montana problem. So for some of the police officers who would be charged with trying to root out this problem, the reason why they never could was because they were investigating themselves. The hoods just hid who they were. And so, unfortunately, not a lot is going to be done to investigate these murders and other atrocities. Now, as you can kind of tell here, Reconstruction has largely failed. It hasn't done what it has needed to. Now, Reconstruction will officially come to an end with the election of 1876 and the Compromise of 1877. The election of 1876 features the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes versus a Democrat Samuel Tilden. Now, the Republicans have grown a lot less popular throughout the country due to the notable corruption scandals during the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant. Now, Tilden has won the popular vote, but the election results themselves are contested, so we don't have the selection of a president, and that will lead us to the Compromise of 1877. So in order to stop the chaos, the Republicans offer the Democrats a deal. Name Rutherford B. Hayes the winner of the election, and they will agree to remove all federal troop support in the South. They will agree to stop supporting and reinforcing any equality laws and stop any protection of African Americans. The South will agree, and that brings an end to Reconstruction. So what was meant to heal the country will instead fail in its objective, and African Americans, with the promise of freedom from slavery, find themselves the victims of terrorism and slavery by another name. It will necessitate a new movement, a new civil rights movement, which unfortunately will not come for another 80 years. And so the great sin of the Civil War is not that it was fought, but rather that the wounds of it were not allowed to heal. The wounds were not allowed to close, but instead remained open to fester and rot. And so now the United States is forced to reckon with those wounds once again and ultimately deal with the issues that have caused it. So, thank you guys for joining me today. That is the end of Chapter 2. Next class, we will deal with Chapter 3 and the migration and settlement of the West. So once again, thank you guys. Have a great day. I will see you all next time. Take care.